Good evening. My name is Caitlin Yarnall, and I'm the Chief Storytelling Officer at the National Geographic Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our event tonight. Though you're watching through your computer screens, we are in fact live and broadcasting from Grosvenor Auditorium at the National Geographic headquarters in downtown Washington, D.C. Before we begin, I want to thank our donors and supporters who make it possible for the National Geographic Society to invest in and elevate the work of explorers around the world. Through their support, National Geographic has remained committed for 130 years to telling stories about people with transformative ideas and documenting stories of our shared human experience. To learn more about making a donation or supporting our programs, I encourage you to visit nationalgeographic.org. I'm so pleased that you're all tuning in today to hear from one of my favorite storytellers, Pete Muller. He's originally from the United States, but his work has taken us to many foreign locations. He's covered conflict, masculinity, nationalism in South Sudan, the Palestinian territories, and elsewhere. Pete has contributed to publications like the New York Times and, of course, National Geographic magazine. He's also worked for the International Criminal Court and Amnesty International, to name just a few organizations. What I love about Pete and his work is that he's always seeking to make connections with those he photographs, and connections between the stories, cultures, locations, and themes that he interrogates. Pete doesn't view our complex world simply, but he does help us to understand some of the chaos that we frequently encounter. Pete's photographs have been recognized globally with some of the highest awards. He was named Photographer of the Year by Pictures of the Year International. He's won first prize in the World Press Photo Competition for his work during the Ebola outbreak, and I could go on. Pete is undoubtedly an artist in his own right, but he's also a teacher. He was a visiting professor at Mount Holyoke College. He's also worked with National Geographic as one of our instructors at Photo Camp, a program that works with youth around the world to tell their own stories. I think that what makes Pete such an effective teacher is that he focuses not only on imagery, but methodology. Pete's brain is just as engaged as his eyes when he works. Tonight, Pete is going to share some of his work on Solastalgia that he produced as a storytelling fellow. He'll be taking questions at the end of his talk, so jot down and submit his questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the chat window. I'll be rejoining him to help with that discussion. But now, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to my friend, Pete Muller.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Stage is yours.
Thanks. Well, good evening, everybody. It feels like a strange thing to say to an empty room, but I feel like we could all agree that it's been a pretty strange year, so maybe it's fitting. It's hard for me to tell anymore. But I can't lie. I don't think I've really found my sense of emotional equilibrium with all of this incredible change that we've all experienced over this last year. Feels like everything that we thought that we knew has changed. It makes me feel like the times, this longing for the times when a room like this would be alight with all of this incredible energy of all of these people coming from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different disciplines, all coming together to share in our common sense of wonder and curiosity about the world. I miss those things. And I know that the constant refrain these days is that we are going to be okay and this is all going to shake out okay, and it will. It will. What choice do we have? But in a lot of ways, it feels to me like we are in uncharted territory. And that uncharted territory is complex. Of course, it's medical uncharted territory in the form of COVID-19, this virus that we've never seen, but all of these countermeasures that are add-ons to that. The uncharted territory of the political fallout, the logistical fallout, the economic fallout, all of these changes. To those things, I might add the emotional uncharted territory. I don't think that we've truly been able to, at least myself, haven't really been able to make clear sense of how this experience has felt over these last 9 months. And as we move through some of this conversation and material tonight, I might urge you to think a little bit about what this year has felt like to you. How are you encapsulating and talking about and expressing how you feel in these unprecedented times? And what I'd like to do is tell you just a little bit about myself as a photographer and as a person, the journey that I've been on that's allowed me to ask and attempt to engage with these types of questions. Maybe I feel some of this sense of social discord and discomfort maybe a little bit more strongly than other people do because my work is fundamentally social. As a photographer, I've really wanted nothing more than to understand the delicate social tapestries around me. I've wanted to stand in places of social communion, places like this, church service in Kichanga, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. I was based in East and Central Africa for over a decade. I wanted to understand the social fabrics that I was encountering there in places like this, which in many cases were defined by ongoing conflicts. I wanted to understand the antecedents of this social phenomenon, what was driving these wars. I wanted to understand their impact on the most vulnerable of populations, women and children, the elderly, non-combatants. People like these, a woman and her child, whose identities have been intentionally obscured. This woman was a survivor of a mass rape event in Eastern Congo, and she wanted her young son to be really the centerpiece of this photograph. He was tossed aside by the soldiers who attacked her, and he has suffered that wound that you see on his head. She wanted that to be the visual note that was communicated to the world. But beyond this demographic of people, I've also really wanted to understand those who tend to be the architects and the implementers of armed conflict, men. What is it that happens in our minds, our acculturation, our education, our sense of behavioral education that makes us inclined to participate in violence? These are questions that have long been of interest to me. And I do this work in two ways. Sometimes I do deep anthropological dives in one location, and sometimes I do a thematic assessment across a bunch of different areas, all with the core belief that our commonalities are greater than our differences, the basis of human experience, our wants, our desires, our sense of ambition and connection and fears. These things are common. I'd argue that Shadrach Nyangosa, 14-year-old boy that we see here in this picture on the dawning morning of his circumcision ceremony when he would become a man in the Luya areas of Western Kenya, that in fact Shadrach has quite a lot in common with Drew Moore, who we see here many, many, many thousands of miles away on Peters Island in Mississippi, undergoing his own rite of passage into American manhood, hunting hogs with his father and a group of men. And I think that photography, when it's thoughtfully employed, can really serve as a powerful vehicle for understanding this connectedness that we share. This type of exploration was really imparted to me as a young child, really, by my mother, Paula, who was also a newspaper photographer. This is a photograph that I took of my mother in the decommissioned darkroom of the Lynn Daily Evening Item, a small daily newspaper on the North Shore of Boston where I grew up. We spent a lot of time in this darkroom. I was a terribly mischievous child. I couldn't stay out of trouble. So I was conscripted into photography far before I ever wanted to be. My mother would enlist me to carry her bags, her lenses, and I would take down people's names. And after covering her suite of assignments and whatever breaking news had transpired in the day, we would retreat into the stillness of the darkroom together. She would make prints on the enlarger, and she would hand me those pieces of paper, and I would slip them into the chemical baths, and images would appear, images like this one. Tough images sometimes of things that often I had witnessed with my mother. She shielded me from little. And I would be asking questions about what had transpired, what was causing what we were seeing. And she would give me this form of progressive social education about what we were seeing. What was causing this, in this instance, this woman to be reaching out to touch the portrait of her young son who was murdered in a gang rivalry? Structural exclusion, marginalization, lack of access to opportunities, dwindling middle class, consolidation of wealth under a smaller and smaller group of people. This was the social education that she provided. And she came from the world of the visual arts herself. That trickled down farther. This is my maternal grandfather, Leon Kelly, in a sort of eccentric moment of communion with migratory birds on this small island off the coast of New Jersey where he lived. He was a painter. He was born in Philadelphia. And he won a scholarship in the 1920s to study painting in Paris. And he lived there for about a decade, where he was exposed to Surrealism, a movement that was burgeoning in Europe but had yet to really arrive on the shores of the United States. And when he returned about a decade later, he brought it with him. He became one of the pioneers of the American abstract surrealist movement. Painted images like this one, the tenderness of maternity. reclining moors. He was fascinated by the natural world, particularly bird and insect life, and those things populated his images. He was relatively successful. He has paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Whitney and other notable institutions, but he was also a deeply tormented and conflicted person, and that cast a long shadow of the notion of creation in our family. This is a portrait that my mother took of her and her father not long before he died. It's called Family Ties. The visual tradition was alive on my father's side of the family as well. This is my paternal grandfather, Eric Muller, standing his photographic apron not long after he immigrated to the United States from Sweden. He had trained as a photographer there. And he came and he found work at the Sanford Photographic Studios in Lynn, Massachusetts, the same city where my mother was subsequently the newspaper photographer. He was a really skilled, capable darkroom technician, printmaker, and of course a photographer himself. He largely employed photography as a commercial enterprise, but he also used it to document his own life and the buoyancy of his existence. He was a happy person, and he wanted to chronicle that. This was one of my favorite images. This was a Christmas card. He'd make Christmas cards, birthday cards to honor these occasions. This is the Christmas card from 1946, the year after the Second World War had ended. The Mullers are developing and fixing the best of greetings for you. And those of you who don't know the traditional photographic process, developing and fixing, these are central components of the chemical process that yielded images. So in addition to these types of pictures, he also made beautiful, artistic, painterly types of photographs, like this one of my young father at the age of 3 in 1939, standing with his mother, my grandmother, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in Nahant, Massachusetts. This photograph was taken on Kodachrome slide film. So all these years later, we still have this beautiful rendering. My father drew some source of inspiration from the familiarity that he developed with the visual world through his father and photography, and he melded that with his own aptitude for science. He became a conservator of art, doing technical restoration on paintings and drawings, sculptures and frescoes. This is a photograph of him doing some restoration on an Italian Renaissance painting at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And to me, as a kid, I could not imagine anything more boring than this job. This painstaking work done under magnifying glass with all of this meticulous attention to detail, mixing the paints in just the right way so they would age with the rest of the composition of the paint. I didn't have the patience for this. I was a rambunctious kid. I wanted to run around. I wanted to shout and yell. I wanted to touch stuff. I wanted to break things. You know, this was not the type of environment for a kid of my temperament. But what it did at a subconscious level was that it exposed me to the principles, the visual principles of Western art. I was able to see things that ultimately began to influence me. Paintings, not that I saw this particular painting, but paintings like The Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. Single source lighting like this. The incredibly tonal, moody works of American painters like Andrew Wyeth. The beautiful drawings and etchings of Martin Lewis, who was one of the instructors of one of the more famous 20th century American painters, Edward Hopper, whose work also became of interest to me later on. Painters from the Hudson River School, notably Thomas Cole, who not only gave us these incredible pictures about the grandeur and sublime elements of nature, but also these incredible intellectual, allegorical stories of human civilization. And these things, this experience that I had with my mother in the photographic world and some of these elements of the classical world of art came together in me to a degree as I started to reach out and want to understand the social world around me, living and working in places like South Sudan, chronicling that country's movement towards independence, chronicling the Egyptian Revolution, stories of daily life, overcoming resilience and adversity across the sub-Saharan African continent where I was based for all of those years, utilizing some of these visual principles to start to tell the stories of resource scarcity in nomadic pastoral communities, of conflicts in the Republic of Georgia and South Ossetia. And after years of working in this way, I began to contribute to National Geographic magazine. I'd been working for newspapers and wire services and other things. And I started to contribute here, doing this type of sociological photography. And after some years, I started to wonder if there wasn't a place, perhaps, for my type of humanistic social photography in addressing this pressing conversation that we're having in so many corners of the world about environmental degradation. Now, I knew that National Geographic had really been a standard bearer for disseminating information about the physical changes that we were seeing in the world, the disappearance of critical species, the need to protect endangered habitats, the proliferation of carbon particles into the environment, and all of the implications of that process. And that's all, of course, the bedrock fundamentals of the physical changes that we're seeing in the world. But to me, as someone that's so interested in the humanistic elements, those things could feel a little bit distant, sterile, that they were sort of lacking a kind of heartbeat. And I wondered if I might be able to contribute something that might present a different way of looking at these things. And so I adopted an idea of how I might attempt to do that. And I'd like to take you on a little bit of that journey. This is the Upper Hunter Valley. It's this absolutely beautiful, idyllic river valley, about 3.5 hours north of Sydney in Australia. And for most of its modern history, it's been known for really beautiful things, the breeding of thoroughbred horses and alfalfa fields and wine vineyards, citrus groves. But in the late 1980s, there was a massive discovery underneath the valley floor. And the discovery was of large deposits of high-quality coal. And companies started to arrive into the Upper Hunter, and they started to dig big holes to get at this valuable resource. Holes like this one. This is the Mount Thorley Walkworth mine in the Shire of Singleton. It's absolutely enormous. It's kilometers long, kilometers wide. It's about 1,000 feet deep. It's visible from space. And you can see on the right side of the frame these cars, these little white dots that give it some sense of scale. Now, open pit coal mines like this began to open all throughout the Upper Hunter Valley, and with them came all of this related, transformative change. Of course, you're digging massive holes, and so you're left with all of this dirt. So all of a sudden there are these massive hills where there weren't before. So there was this strange and notable topographic change. There was also a lot of noise and light and dust pollution. It was a sort of social change that began to happen, where families that had been there for generations began to leave, and legions of new people who were involved with extractive industry started to show up. This was a really jolting event for such a small rural community. This is Glen Albrecht. Glen is an environmental philosopher, and at the time he was a professor of sustainability at a nearby university. And Glen began to take a particular interest in the social impacts that these mines were having on the communities around them. In particular, he was interested in the emotional impact that they were having. And as the mines continued to spread, word of his interest also spread. And the phone in his office began to ring. And on the other end were people like Wendy Bowman. Wendy was beside herself. She'd been living in the Upper Hunter Valley for the vast majority of her adult life. She was in these acrimonious battles with mining companies that were attempting to expropriate parts of her property for exploration, for coal exploration. She was involved as an advocate on behalf of other people who were in similar predicaments with the mining companies that didn't necessarily have the expertise or wherewithal that she'd developed. She was serving as an informal marriage counselor for all of these people whose relationships were on the precipice of implosion under the stress and pressure that they were facing. Wendy couldn't sleep at night. Glen started to hear from people like John. John has been around a long time. He was a soldier. He'd been a farmer. He was not the type of guy of the generational ilk that believed much in psychological challenges being much to worry about. And I'd like to let John Lamb speak a little bit for himself here about his experience in the Upper Hunter and what it did to him emotionally.
You maybe did a good job the day before, you've had a good sleep, you wake up, feel refreshed, get in the car, drive to town. As soon as you reach the desolation of the mine, your heart just falls, because you see what was once a beautiful, productive farm is now this wasteland. I will drive out of my way, maybe 40 or 50 kilometres extra, so that I don't have to drive through the mine. I always thought that depression was a I suppose, a state of mind, but that you could just grab yourself by the ears and give yourself a shake and get out of it. But the truth of it was that when it struck me, because of the effects of the mine, that there was no way out of it, and medication and counselling was the only ways that I could deal with it.
Glen Albrecht started to hear a lot of stories like John Lamb's story. And certain commonalities started to stand out to him. It was as though the residents of the Upper Hunter knew that the mines were the source of their distress, but they had a very difficult time expressing in any succinct way how it was that it was making them feel. Some attempted in blunt ways, like John, to identify it as depression. It didn't seem entirely accurate. It was almost like more of them wanted to say that it was like homesickness. But that didn't entirely make sense because nobody had left home. Really what it was almost as though home or some essence of home had left them. We didn't really have a concept for that. It wasn't really nostalgia, which interestingly enough was created and bestowed upon the world in this doctoral thesis by a young Swiss-German doctor trainee named Johannes Hofer. Hofer created this concept to describe a social phenomenon that was prevalent in Switzerland at the time of relatively young people, students and mercenaries who were extracted from their home environments, set someplace different, and started to experience a form of melancholy that was so severe that it was thought to kill them. Nostalgia, nostos algos, the pain to return. That was the name that Johannes Hofer, who we see a picture of here, gave this phenomenon. And it existed as a cause of death that would be listed on death certificates for over 300 years in Western medicine. That's how that concept came into existence. Now, of course, it began to transform in a way in the 20th century to not become a medical diagnosis in that traditional way, but that it became a sort of sentimental idea. It was, a longing for better days gone by. But even that updated version of nostalgia didn't necessarily seem right, because what was going on in the Upper Hunter was not necessarily a longing for better days gone by that had fallen by the wayside because of the inevitable progression of time. That's just life. This was more about something being lost, or really something being taken in the present, that had to some degree nostalgic implications for the past, but also had foreboding notions of how people related to this place and how they saw themselves in the future. As far as Glen Albrecht could tell, there was no word or concept to describe this feeling that he was encountering so frequently. So he sat down with his wife and his intellectual partner, Jill, and they decided, we have to name this. This cannot be so common and not have a name. Without a name, people are at a disadvantage. They can't make sense of it within themselves, and they certainly can't share it with others. And in order to try to name this, they had to think in very basic terms about what exactly was underway. What were the basic hallmarks of this feeling that Glen was encountering so often? Well, they knew that there was a pain, that there was a longing, this algia, like nostalgia. But this wasn't the pain to return. This was people who were emplaced where they belonged. This pain pertained to their homes. And what are our homes, Glen and Jill thought? Well, they give us a sense of comfort at some basic level. And Glen thought, okay, that's interesting. But he couldn't figure out how to take the English language concept of comfort and create a new term that might have implications, might have the ability to be used more widely to describe what he felt was this common human experience. So they took out this book of synonyms and antonyms that Jill had from her school days, and they looked up the word comfort. And there they found a synonym, solace, to have a sense of peace. And Glen thought, well, I think that might have legs, that might work. And so in an academic paper in 2003, Glen Albrecht began to refer to this complex sense of a loss of sense of place, this feeling of homesickness that you have while you're still at home. He started to call this solastalgia. Sort of in a more technical definitions, it's a sense of existential or psychic distress that's prompted by negative changes in a person's home environment. I'd like to take a moment to allow Glen Albrecht to talk for a moment about the rationale for creating this concept in the first place.
We didn't have in the English language a word that even came close to explaining the particular and unique type of distress that humans feel when confronted with environmental change that they find uncomfortable or negative. Part of the problem that we're facing in the 21st century is the lack of a conceptual or linguistic apparatus to actually explain the problems that we're experiencing in our day-to-day lives. You can only begin to address the cause of something that's giving you grief if you have a shared understanding of what the cause is. If it hasn't been named in some way that enables instant recognition and sharing, then of course you're in trouble.
Now, I first heard this word in a National Geographic documentary film about water shortages in California, and I thought, solastalgia, what on earth is that? I had no idea how to spell it. I tried to make a note. I put it into a Google search, and this incredible repository of material popped up. Works of art, piano concertos, sculptures, journalistic works, academic articles, articles in medical journals, all these things, all this form of varied engagement with this concept and this unusual new word for it. And I thought, this is amazing. This is a fascinating new frontier in our relationship with the natural world. And this wasn't just about the changes that are occurring outside of us, about which we know a fair amount already. This was about how those changes are being mirrored back within us. And without words to acknowledge, express, and make communicable and visible these otherwise invisible experiences, perhaps we are not seeing the true extent of our impact in this domain. And maybe that is part of the problem. And so with support from National Geographic, I began to explore this idea of solastalgia. I began to travel to various places where forms of degradation and change were underway, and I began to make photographs and collect oral histories, talked a lot with people about the nature of this feeling. I traveled high into the Andes Mountains in the Cusco region of Peru to attend what's called the Coyoriti Festival. It's an annual pilgrimage on behalf of several nations of indigenous Quechua community that inhabit this particular part of South America. The Coyoriti Festival commemorates the beginning of the Andean New Year. It also commemorates the upcoming harvest season. And the exact timing of the festival depends on the appearance of celestial constellations that appear again in the night sky. And at the center of this pilgrimage, of this sacred festival, are a series of glaciers that are thought to embody the spirit of the Lord of Coyoriti, the Lord of the Ice. And in recent decades, these glaciers, as a result of global warming, have been reduced by many orders of magnitude, disappearing quite rapidly. This is Norberto Vega. He's the president of the Coyoriti Association. He's the one that orchestrates the pilgrimage each year. It's a massive logistical undertaking. Upwards of 100,000 pilgrims make this annual trek up into the mountains to participate in Coyoriti. He's been participating since he was a boy. We see him here in a portrait in his home with his wife and his 2 daughters and his son Nicholas. And in addition to being a spiritual touchstone for those who observe this outlook, it's also a cornerstone of identity that's passed from one generation to the next. We see Norberto and Nicholas now in discussion here about various aspects of the accessories that are carried with the men as they make their pilgrimage up to the glaciers during Coyoriti. Now, the threat that's posed to the glaciers from global warming is not the only threat that's facing the sanctuary, the physical grounds on which this transpires. This is a map that Norberto showed me that shows mining concessions. In the center of this map, that sort of mushroom-shaped blue-green shape, that's the sanctuary area of Coyoriti, the sacred grounds on which the festival takes place. And all around that, those boxes of different colors represent mining concessions. Norberto fears that once those mining concessions become operable, the territorial integrity of the festival and its transit routes will be deeply compromised. Now, as the constellations come into view, men known as Pablitos, those the guardians of the festival, liaisons, the Lord of Koiriti, make this ascent up towards the glaciers in a pre-dawn procession. There they perform prayers and cleansing rituals. And in this conversation, this group conversation, this is the Quispicanchi nation that Norberto Vega is in charge of. There's also a lengthy conversation about what, if anything, can be done to preserve these physical features of the world that are so integral to this spiritual practice. Now, I'd like to let Norberto speak a little bit, both about some of the practicalities of the festival and about the emotional experience of watching these changes.
¿Qué pasaba acá? Algo curioso, que eso es parte de la fe, que la medicina del hielo curaba cualquier mal hacia el ser humano. Entonces, para nosotros es tan importante el hielo. Es el sentimiento que me queda por dentro, ¿no? La impotencia de no poder hacer nada. O sea, a veces me pongo tan melancólico que hasta me da ganas de llorar al ver el glaciar, que cada año que voy se va alejándose más.
That feeling of powerlessness that Norberto describes there is a consistent hallmark of this feeling that so many people feel as they watch these changes unfolding around them. It's a critical part of what Glen Albrecht would describe more broadly as the solastalgic experience. I spent weeks with Norberto and many of the pilgrims that make this annual procession to attend the Koiriti Festival to discuss the texture, the subtleties of this experience of watching physical features connected to spiritual elements disappear in the world around us. Also, Norberto said that neither in Spanish nor in Quechua is there a word that encapsulates this feeling. Did a case study of this project in Paradise, California, where, as some of you know, the Camp Fire in November of 2018 decimated this town in a very short period of time. I wanted to understand the potential solastalgic dimensions of an experience where the change was so rapid. And in order to do that, I had to try to understand the sense of place. What was this community like? You know, a place is so much more than its physicality. It's breathed life into by the people who inhabit it. And in order to do this, I spoke at length with people like Don Criswell and his wife, Debbie. We see Don here at the piano. He's a private investigator in his day job, but he moonlights as a piano player at all of the different bars and lodges and churches and things around Paradise. And I'd like to let Don talk a little bit about his sense of place and how he contributed to it.
I dressed up. I tried to look nice, you know. It was a nice joint. It's white tablecloths and candlelight and all of that. So it was a nice place, and tried to be, you know, the piano man. That was not my intention. Was to be the entertainer. It was to be the background, to turn dinner into a date. And I saw it happen, Pete, so many times. The couple would come in and sit down, but about 20 minutes into the thing, the guy would take his ball cap off. And then a little bit later, they would be a little bit closer to each other. I saw that happen 1,000 times in 4 years, all right? You know, Debbie's been really gracious and patient. She told me that she knows I miss Smoky Mountain. I miss playing, you know, all this music. But she's got me back.
Don Criswell is forever the optimist. I was so interested in how he describes that subtlety of sense of place. So poignant and beautiful. As I was working on this component of this project, I was approached by Courtney Monroe, who's the president of National Geographic Channel and our documentary film studio. And she approached me to say that they were working on a film with the director Ron Howard about the fires in Paradise and the attempt to rebuild it. She asked me if I might go up to New York City and have a meeting with the producers and executive producers of this project, and I did. We had a fascinating, lengthy, hours-long conversation about this notion of a sort of organizing principle of the emotions of dealing with these types of massive environmental transformations. Some of these discussions started to become a bit of the organizing principles of how this film came together. It's called Rebuilding Paradise, and it premiered as a streaming option on Sunday night. And I'd like to show you a little bit about how they started to cultivate this supple notion of sense of place.
If you know this community, it has a very strong sense of place, and it's been there for over 100 years.
Its heritage was, you know, gold rush days. It really is a pioneering spirit.
I can remember when I was young. No restrictions to speak of, no ordinances, no laws. Was a great contributor to moving people to paradise.
It was always surprising to learn that Paradise was a city of 26,500 because it never felt like that, ever.
It was like quintessential small town America. It's kind of the other part of California you never knew was here.
Some of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet.
Anything that's a lifetime first, I did in Paradise.
Where we lived, it was a good spot. I could hear the school bell ring when it was time to go to class. On weekends, there was little league softball fields. You hear the crack of the bat and parents cheering and stuff like that.
Who are you seeing there?
There's no place like Paradise. That'll always be home to me. You can't replace that.
I think the team did such an extraordinary job of capturing some of those intangible elements of that sense of place. I was really honored to contribute, and beyond doing some of that conceptual consultation, I was also able to spend time with members of the cast, the participants of the film. And I was particularly interested in some of the reflections of a woman named Carly Ingersoll, who features prominently in Rebuilding Paradise. She was the school psychologist at Paradise High School, and she offered such interesting insights into this sort of common nature of some of the texture, of the sense of loss that pervaded the town. Her house didn't burn during the fire, but most of the neighborhood around her did.
When you still have your home, but you're talking about homesickness, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. The homesickness is the friendships I've lost because they're gone, the neighbors that I don't interact with anymore. When I walk into my home, it is just a place to live. It is not my home anymore. And it has caused me great strife because I don't have anywhere else to go. All of us are feeling different feelings, but we all feel that sense of loss, of community, of peace, that solace. If we can define it, what it is that we're missing, then maybe we can work on ways and strategies and interventions to try to get some of that back.
Now, at the risk of treating this in a bit too cursory a manner, I'd like to conclude with just a little bit of connective tissue to what Carly says from one of the final case studies that I did on this project. And that was on a small, beautiful, very biodiverse island in southeast Louisiana called Isle de Jean Charles. This island gets smaller every year. In fact, it's lost 98% of its land mass over the last 50 years. And this is due to a confluence of circumstances. Rising sea levels, changes in the sediment deposit patterns coming out of the Mississippi River, and the digging of navigational and extraction canals for oil and gas. This has conspired to make a profound impact on coastal erosion. And because of this, the storm surges that are becoming increasingly intense off of the Gulf of Mexico have really threatened the remaining inhabitants, necessitating a plan to begin to start perhaps moving people away from this island. And the two people that you see in this photograph seated at the table, Chantel Commerdale and her father Boyo, have been instrumental in trying to orchestrate the efforts to relocate this community, which has meant confronting, essentially, the loss of the habitability of Isle de Jean Charles. And I was so interested in what Chantel said about her shared sense of this type of loss and confronting what it means to see a place dissipate in this regard. I'd like to let her share some of those reflections herself here.
Going through this process, we've met other communities, and there's a community in Alaska who's had the same thing. And we were able to sit down and talk about things, and it was almost exactly the same feelings, the same emotion that they went through. It was like, oh, okay, so I'm not alone. This isn't just something I'm making up in my mind, you know. It was real. It became real.
It became real. And it became real in part for Chantel because she knew that other people felt it too. that she wasn't alone. She was in a unique situation where she was actually able to close the distance between herself and that community in Newtok, Alaska, who'd gone through similar circumstances. And they were able to sit and converse and flesh out the commonality in this experience that they'd had. But where that's not possible, perhaps something as simple as a word that encapsulates adequately and acknowledges a shared experience can build that sense of community. We are a social species that's evolved over tens of thousands of years to have an abiding need to understand ourselves and those around us. And we know that when we share a common cause, when we're trying to rectify a problem with a common source, that we are infinitely capable of devising solutions. And so with that, I think I'll end, and Caitlin will come back on stage and we'll open this to more of a conversation. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Pete. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
I just want to remind the audience who's here with us live that you can enter your questions in the chat function on your screen, and Pete and I have about 20 minutes to answer them. But before we turn over to the audience, I'm going to be selfish and ask you some questions myself.
Sure.
Yeah. So, Pete, so many of the examples you gave that illustrate solastalgia are environmental based. And I think that most of us right now find ourselves in the middle of a health crisis, an epidemiological crisis. And I'm wondering, while you didn't talk explicitly about a health crisis, some of the feelings of loss of community and loss of routine may apply. Do you think it's a valid comparison?
You know, I've thought an awful lot about that since this sort of era of COVID-19 and all of its countermeasures have set in. And, you know, I will count myself fortunate that I have not really experienced at a personal level this type of massive environmental transformation in my own home environment. But something that I noticed as such a commonality among virtually every group of people that I spoke to about this process is that, in fact, people seem very resilient and capable of overcoming huge amounts of physical transformation. It can really adjust to physical transformation, no matter how drastic. But where it really begins to cut deep is when it starts to affect people's sense of social connection and community. And those things are often intertwined, as such they are in the Hunter Valley, where the intensification of mining drove people away, and that started to cause this social fragmentation, and that's what cuts the deepest. And I couldn't help but think that the global situation with COVID-19 countermeasures almost bypassed all of the sort of otherwise requisite environmental, physical transformation and put us all in this situation where we were suddenly lacking the sense of community and connection that we really, so many of us really thrive from. So in a way, I started to feel like I was understanding this concept and experience of solastalgia much better as we all underwent that process. And in fact, I started to make a series of sort of personal photographs that I published in Vogue Italia, along with an essay that sort of explained how I saw those parallels. And I actually have like a couple of those photographs here. You know, I was making these diptych images of some of the landscape at that time I was here in Washington. Of course, the landscape, the physical landscape, during this crisis remains intact entirely. No physical things have changed. But there is an environmental transformation in the form of the introduction of this pathogen that completely cleansed the landscape of all of its inhabitants. So it didn't feel like the same place. So I was working to try to relay, in some ways, my own sense of, perhaps of solastalgia, but certainly a sense of major social and emotional dislocation during that time. So I think there's an applicability, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And while we have this backdrop of a global pandemic, which is impacting us all in different ways, the natural crises haven't stopped, right? Do you see the need for the word to continue to be used and to be spread? I mean, obviously it has resonated with you. You've made this whole body of work around it, but how do you think it's applicable now more than ever?
Well, I think that you know, part of Glen Albrecht's outlook in his creation of this concept was that, you know, he would say that human beings have experienced the sort of what he would call the solastalgic moment of watching an environment change from time immemorial. This is not a new experience. But what is new is the extent to which it's happening, the speed at which it's happening. We're now living in an era of expanded and accelerated environmental transformation in so many different parts of the world. And therefore, you know, this experience that at one point would be relatively isolated to small groups of people is now becoming a prominent feature in the lives of so many people, such that perhaps we need new words and terminologies to make this stuff accessible. So that people know that they're not alone. And interestingly, another thing that Ron Howard and Zan Parker and the team that worked on Rebuilding Paradise did was that they also drew upon that. And actually, there's another clip that I'd like to show that showcases a little bit about that connection from Paradise to the rest of the world.
Today's the last day to donate to the Alabama fundraiser. So if you guys have any last minute donations, put them in super fast.
We heard about tornadoes that hit Alabama. We decided it'd be nice to show them the support that we got.
Before, I'd see the news and I'd be like, oh, that's really sad. Like, I hope that they can get help and stuff. But now I see the news and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to help them.
We understand the feeling, so.
Beauregard, Alabama.
Oh my God.
It is the worst tornado outbreak in the United States in nearly 6 years.
Dorian is now one of the most powerful hurricanes in history.
Cape Town could become the first major city to run out of water.
Floodwaters in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal have left tens of thousands stranded.
Flames devoured seaside resort towns along Greece's eastern coast.
More than 1 million Japanese people have been advised to leave their homes.
We are dealing with record-breaking floods.
For the first time, the threat level across Sydney was dialed up to catastrophic.
As weather conditions deteriorated, fire after fire escalated to emergency level.
Such an interesting, simple thing that's said in that clip, that we know the feeling. You know, we used to see it on the news, but now we know the feeling. And I think that Glen Albrecht feels that so many people are coming to know the feeling, that feeling ought to have a name.
So this is a thing I think about a lot is I watch this reel of all these disasters that are happening, and if it could help these people to know that they're not alone, that this feeling is universal if you've gone through it. How do we get this word into usage? How do we make it part of our everyday vocabulary? How does that happen?
Well, that's interesting. There are people who study that process, both as sort of something that can be designed, but also people who study it from a historical perspective. One of the people that I spent some time interviewing for this is this fascinating cultural historian in the UK named Tiffany Watts-Smith, and she studies the cultural history of emotions, and she has done a whole body of research on how exactly these emotion concepts come into existence. And really what happens is there's this type of attraction that happens. Somebody like Glen Albrecht has an idea, he creates a concept, and somebody finds it interesting and they make a piece of art about it, and then somebody writes about that piece of art, and then, you know, there develops this type of snowball effect. When something is lodged in our consciousness, which I think that the environmental crisis is at this stage, is lodging in our consciousness in a way that there becomes a sort of a willingness and an interest to engage in this. And I think to a degree it's an organic process, but this is part of how it works. We've now done a story about it, other people have done stories about it, and if it resonates with people, then it persists.
And I guess everyone here tonight could start using it if they wanted to.
If they feel that it's helpful. And it's important also to say, I feel I owe it to Glen Albrecht to say that, you know, this he felt was his best effort to create something. It's a creative endeavor to make a word. I'd never even thought about what it's like to try to create a word for something. And this was his best attempt to give you know, some articulatable form to this feeling. But certainly he would say that he's certainly open to all kinds of suggestions and conversations about how and what we can name these phenomena, so long as they have some name, so that we know that they're there, really.
Interesting. Well, we have a couple questions that have come in from the audience. I want to go to one now that I feel is related. This comes in from Philip. He says, "Thank you, Pete, for your work. I work in the field of human-animal connection and wondering if you feel that the loss of biodiversity, animals in particular, relational poverty lost through the loss of other non-human animals can be defined as solastalgia. So if we lose a species, does that count?"
Well, you know, I've tried to stay away in my role as a photographer, as a communicator, from sort of wading into the waters of what does and doesn't constitute an instance of solastalgia. But I happen to know on this front that that Glen Albrecht has written things about, like for instance, in the wake of mad cow disease, where there had to be so many head of cattle exterminated in the British countryside, that fundamentally changed that landscape. To an extent, such that people really felt like it wasn't the same place because it was missing something so vital that identified it as familiar to them. So I would suppose that Albrecht would consider certainly a lack of biodiversity or the disappearance of a species that was defining to a landscape as an element of the solastalgic experience.
Well, and I think for me, this word and this work stirs up, well, what about all these other instances, a health pandemic, loss of biodiversity? It may be that we need more words, right? That this could fit into.
Sure. I don't think we need to force it necessarily. And Glenn created this, then there can be creation of many other things.
Yeah. We have another question from Michael. He says, first of all, excellent presentation. And he said, what suggestions, and I would say, or can you, offer for resolution and healing in these situations?
Well, certainly I feel like, I think it seems like common knowledge that instances of adversity create a sense of connection between people. And I think that really what has stood out to me so much in this process is this notion of not being alone. You know, I think it's so vital for so many of us to know that we're not alone. And I think that, you know, there are certainly lots of people who are working diligently to devise ways, therapeutic ways of people dealing with post-traumatic events and events that relate to major sense of loss of place and things. But I think that sense of community that tends to ensue in the face of adversity can be incredibly healing. I mean, as deeply afflicted as people and suffering as people were in the wake of these environmental transformations that I covered, there was also certainly a large degree of a sense of connection that I think carried people through a fair amount of that adversity. Yeah.
I guess none of us ever want to really be alone in our feelings.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
We have a question that came in from Sebastian, but I want to ask a related one first. You obviously were limited by time and budget on this project. What were some of the case studies that you would have loved to include that you couldn't go to?
Well, we had thought, actually, another one of our explorers, a mutual friend of ours, Naftali Hanig, who does a lot of conservation work in Central Africa. We talked about our shared interest. He works in the Garamba National Park, as you know, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we talked about our shared interest in desertification and the implications, the migratory implications of increasing desertification, particularly in the Sahel region of Africa, and what that meant in terms of migration of pastoralists who are seeking increasingly scarce water and grazing grounds for their cattle, and what that means to see those landscapes transformed, and what it meant in terms of the stability equation in a hotly contested region of the continent, to have all of these new people arriving there. So we certainly wanted to do that story. We thought about doing stories in the Niger Delta. I mean, there are unfortunately a large list of places where you can do this exploration, and I really hope that this work that we were able to do on the generous but inevitably limited resources that we had can inspire other people to tell these stories. You know, this is just a starting point, and the more, Glen Albrecht would certainly say, and I've recorded him as much, saying, this space is as rich and as wide and as open for the vast variety of voices that wish to participate in it, and he and certainly I welcome that.
Very cool. And Sebastian relatedly says, what's the greatest moment that you've not been able to capture, I guess, in these settings and these environments? Was there something you saw that you just thought, wow, I should have been recording that audio or had that camera out?
Well, I mean, what was liberating for me as an artist in this setting was that I really broke from photojournalistic tradition. I mean, some of these photographs are purely photojournalistic, but others are truly portraits. And I was really fortunate to have a fabulous lighting director who worked with me, a guy named Grant Flanagan, who came all around the world with me and was, we were working from the bases of these descriptions that people were offering. So in some instances, we were certainly setting up lights and we were creating these situational portraits that we hoped would be a representation of the feeling that the person was describing. So it was not necessarily as limiting as other projects that I'd worked on in the past, where I was abiding by very strict photojournalistic ethical standards. This was freer, more interpretive and conceptual.
Do you think you'll go back, or do you like this?
I like this, but I feel deep. I really cut my teeth as a photojournalist for a long time, and it was hard for me to move outside of that space. I felt very uncomfortable at the outset, but I think that our experiences, human experiences, are vast and varied, and they require different approaches. And the photojournalistic approach is a profound and important and sort of indelible approach that's so powerful, impactful. But it's not always the right technique. And I think that for myself as a photographer, as an artist, I want to employ what feels like the right technique for the story. And if that's photojournalism, great. And if it's not, I'm becoming more open to using other methods.
And you've delved into the film world now.
Yeah, to some extent, yeah, and I think I'll explore that more moving forward.
Great. We have a question here from Vovo. It says, curious and concerned about how to use this term and lens and still center Indigenous solastalgia loss, instead of focusing on mourning loss felt by settlers and occupiers brought on by colonization and industrialization, especially in terms of the new documentary. And I'm assuming she's speaking about the population you covered in Paradise. Although I would say that you do have quite the indigenous story with the Quechua community in Peru. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, we tried, certainly when we created the composition of the story, I really wanted to try to have it be as expansive and inclusive across populations and geography as possible. There are a multitude of indigenous perspectives that are presented here. The Quechua community in Brazil, in fact, the inhabitants of Isle Jean Charles are in fact a Native American community, the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Native American tribe. And there was another case study that I did in the Russian Arctic with the indigenous Chukchi community there. But I wanted to see a variety of perspectives. Of course, Australia is an industrialized, so-called Western nation with a colonial history. The United States, of course, has the same. But I didn't necessarily want this to be something that felt sort of polarized in either camp, because I think that these experiences are human experiences, and they can be brought about by a variety of transformative forces. But it felt important to me to try to show a wide swath of how people experience this feeling. And certainly, as I mentioned before, I mean, Glen Albrecht is particularly attuned and interested to indigenous perspectives in Australia. And this space has to be as widely contributed to as possible, so that all of those perspectives are aptly represented. We could only do so much, and we tried to create a just and diverse composition.
Yeah, but I think just even establishing this framework invites a lot of people to contribute.
Hopefully.
So I'm going to ask you one last question.
Sure. Yeah.
What's next for you, Pete? Do you feel like you've bookended? Are you done with Solastalgia? Are you going to give it? Are you going to stop? Or are you working on something else? Or will it forever be a lens in which you view the world?
Well, it certainly opened my mind in really profound ways. I mean, this was such a heavy lift for me creatively and intellectually. It was just so far outside of my wheelhouse, as you know. I mean, I focused on conflict and political tumult and these things, and that's where I feel comfortable. So it was a fascinating, enlivening experience. I had to become much more familiar with philosophy and notions of social reality and neurobiology and all this stuff that I never really thought I'd delve into. So it was incredibly enriching in a lot of ways, and I think it will always be a touchstone for me. And I would certainly love to be available to those who really have stories to tell about about these types of transformation. If I can be of any use to those people as they tell those stories themselves, I'd like to be. But you know, I intend to move on to some other issues more pressingly that are of interest to me. I'm going to start a new body of work about men and behavior and masculinity that I feel is really timely and important, both for me personally and I think in our social conversation. I think we're ready for that. So that'll be my next larger endeavor. But I always want to remain connected to this topic. I think it'll unfortunately be relevant for some time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it will. Well, I just want to thank everyone in the audience for tuning in. Thank you for bearing with us as we do live television here, just Pete and I on the stage, far away from each other, unmasked. But I also want to give a huge thank you to our masked crew in the back, to Greg, to Paul, to Shane, to Justin and Kelly, and to Lindsay for answering your questions and fielding those for us. Thank you all so much for joining. We hope you'll tune in soon to another National Geographic Live event, and good evening.